Now, listen, I've been a hardcore Alice in Wonderland fan for several years now. I've read both the books, and I've written way too many essays on the subject matter. And it's because I've dedicated way too much time about this children's book from 1865 that I get thoroughly annoyed whenever I see it used in modern entertainment. Or really, I get annoyed when I see it used lazily and when it's used by people who don't understand what the book is actually trying to do. Or maybe they don't care. Hadn't thought of that. So I thought I'd take the time to lay out everything these writers do wrong when they're adapting Alice in Wonderland into new stories. First of all, it's not a drug trip. Everyone likes to point to the caterpillar smoking and assume that the whole story must be due to a drug trip that Lewis Carroll went on. It's not the case. First of all, the caterpillar is smoking from a hookah, and that's literally all we know. There is no mention of what specifically he's smoking. We can only assume it's a psychedelic drug because he talks slowly. This is literally the only reference to any sort of recreational smoking in both books. Yeah, there's mushrooms too, but those are only there to set the scene and aren't used for recreational means. But for some reason, people like to jump to conclusions and assume that the reasoning behind everything weird is due to drugs, and that's very lazy thinking. You can use drugs as a mean to justify the imagery being used in new stories. It's not like there's anything wrong with making that connection. All I'm saying is that it's a real stretch and shouldn't be used as the basis for your modern interpretations of Alice in Wonderland because it doesn't have any real foundation. The next issue is how people interpret the themes of the book. People often say that there's 3 major themes in Alice in Wonderland, and those are the loss of childhood innocence, life being a meaningless puzzle, and the looming threat of death. And after thinking it over, these are similar to an English teacher overanalyzing the color of a door and thinking that it has greater significance. The problems is that Alice in Wonderland is intentionally vague and intentionally ludicrous to have themes this specific. It's understandable why people can extract these ideas from the book, but you need to keep in mind that Alice in Wonderland is the literary birth of nonsense writing. Every encounter, every reasoning, and even the entire world is supposed to be nonsensical fun. The point is that there is no deeper meaning. Finding a deeper meaning goes against the whole point of the book. The real themes of Alice in Wonderland should be kept much more broad, like curiosity, or growing up, or your own identity. Now, that's not to say the previous themes can't be used. If you really want the loss of childhood innocence to be the theme of your new Alice in Wonderland inspired story, then you just need to stray away from the source material in order to justify that. Like with Alice Madness Returns. It's a stark deviation from the source material, but manages to be a good example because anytime it deviates from the source, it justifies it with its own narrative. Finally, the last misconception of pedophilia in Alice in Wonderland. A lot of people like to try and, quote, ruin your childhood by telling you that the original author of Alice in Wonderland, that being Charles Dodgson, under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll, was a pedophile. And this is to shock people and make the teller of that lie laugh with dubious glee. The problem is that it's not that simple. What you need to understand is that Lewis Carroll took care of several young girls, all of which were his friends' children. He didn't have any children of his own, and he became very good friends with Alice Lindell, a 9-year-old girl which the story is based on. People like to point to the fact that in Lewis Carroll's diary, there's missing pages during the time period where he was taking care of Alice and the other children. And this was also during the time where photography started to get popular, and Lewis Carroll picked up the hobby himself. He took several pictures, including several of girls that were nude and semi-nude. And that's where people just stop and assume he's a pedophile. And today, that would be considered child pornography. But what you need to keep in mind is that this was during the late 1800s. The way people thought of children was not the same way we do today. This was during an exploration into the concept of childhood innocence. And Imagery of semi-nude children could be seen in stuff like postcards, because they only thought of it as a portrayal of innocent children. Even when Lewis Carroll would take pictures of these children, he'd ask the parents' permission first. Over time, as people psychoanalyzed Lewis Carroll and his works, and morals changed over time, he slowly became thought of less positively. To sum it up, we simply don't know 100% if Lewis Carroll was a pedophile. There are some arguments for it, but there's just not enough evidence. And because he was so honored during his lifetime and after his death, it leads one to believe that the allegations are just allegations. Also, the Red Queen and the Queen of Hearts are two separate characters. Most people aren't aware of the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, and that's mostly where this problem comes from. The Queen of Hearts is the playing card character that wants to cut off everyone's head. However, the Red Queen is actually the red chess piece that helps Alice during the events in Through the Looking Glass. It's not actually important, that's just a nitpick that gets on my nerves. The biggest problem I see when people try to implement Alice in Wonderland into their stories is that they don't take the time to properly understand what made Alice in Wonderland unique. You can generally find this problem when people just write characters that just say popular catchphrases from the book, like down the rabbit hole, or curiouser and curiouser, or anything else, and there isn't actually an allusion to the story. The best example of one of the worst written characters that uses Alice in Wonderland for inspiration is Alice from the CW Batwoman series. She exhibits this trait to such an extreme that it makes me roll my eyes with every word that comes out of her mouth.
Curiouser and curiouser.
And to top it off, she's supposed to be the demented and psychologically scarred character. It also doesn't help that the writing in CW's Batwoman is lackluster in general. It's that kind of writing that doesn't do anything with its allusions to the book. It's just a hollow framework they use in order to try and justify the actions of the characters. People who do this tend to forget to include actual justification in their characters and just assume that them being madder than a hatter is enough justification, when it's not. I will say that the writers did give Alice some actual motivation to her actions, but there was never any real delivery behind her motivations. Even the original character, the Mad Hatter from Batman, has this issue. But they typically ignore the Wonderland aspect of his character and focus more on the brainwashing, psychotic villain aspect of his character, so at least he's developed in some capacity. The writers just realized there wasn't anything to do with the Wonderland part of his character, so they largely ignore it. When someone goes so far as to write a good story for Alice in Wonderland, there is two directions that the author needs to keep in mind when constructing the characters and the narrative. You either need to embrace the source material, or you need to build off the source material. And this is one of those rare occasions where I think it's impossible to do both without it just being a blatant ripoff of Alice in Wonderland. Let me explain what I mean. The point of Alice in Wonderland is that it's all literal nonsense. I mentioned earlier that Alice in Wonderland is the birth of nonsense writing, and that's because things just kind of happen in Alice in Wonderland. It's literally all a dream. Nothing really needs to make sense. And the point is that all of it is nonsense. So when someone tackles writing a story around Alice in Wonderland, they either have to embrace the nonsense, or they have to use the themes as the foundation for the story with an actual narrative. Nonsense isn't really one of those things you can sprinkle in and expect to get away with unless the concept of nonsense is established from the beginning. Looney Tune cartoons get away with nonsense because that's what we've come to expect from them. I fully expect Bugs Bunny to be able to whip out multiple guns from his holster, even though it's not logically reasonable that many weapons could be stored there. But I can't expect someone like Geralt from The Witcher to do the same. It just doesn't work. So when a writer is writing a story using Alice in Wonderland, you either need to embrace the nonsense or ignore it. For example, Madeline Hatter from Ever After High is a great example of a character that embraces the nonsense. She's the only person who can hear the narrators.
Hey, kitty. Can I ask you something? See, the narrators have been watching you, and they want to know if I'm a royal or a rebel.
Everything around her floats and morphs its shape for no reason, and she often acts impulsively but never acts in a way that goes against her character. But even in Ever After High, they'll have to justify some of the nonsense just to keep the story intact. But when you're using Alice in Wonderland as a foundation for your writing, you need to abandon the nonsense and justify what's going on. Typically, people will use magic, but even then that's not a surefire way to justify what's happening because the audience tends to expect rules when implementing magic. And that's where using insanity has become so popular. Like, once again, in American McGee's Alice, where everything happening is due to Alice's damaged psyche. Even a drug trip would justify why the nonsense is happening. In short, you either need to have the nonsense be integral to the story, or you need to justify the nonsense. I both love and despise the Disney movie. I love it because it's probably one of the most faithful adaptations of the source material. Even if Tweedledee and Tweedledum aren't actually supposed to be in Wonderland because they're characters in Through the Looking Glass, but whatever. But I also despise it because it portrays all the problems of the story. It's kind of boring. And this is coming from a really big fan of Alice in Wonderland. There's not really a story. Stuff just happens. And in the end you realize it's all a dream, which is probably one of the most painful things that Lewis Carroll could have done, because we want to assume that Wonderland is a real place that we could venture off and explore. Disney's Alice in Wonderland movie does literally nothing to work off the source material. It doesn't try to do anything with it. It's just the same generic, dream-fueled adventure. At least Tim Burton's movie did something with it. And there's people that will claim that the Disney movie is the pinnacle of Alice in Wonderland movies, which I suppose it is, but that's not a good thing. The reason people love Alice in Wonderland is because of everything it's not. It's not really a narrative. There's no real progression. It's just pointless fun. And that becomes a problem when you're trying to use it as a foundation for other stories. That's why the best examples of stories that use Alice in Wonderland as a foundation deviate so strongly from the source, because the source isn't actually a good foundation for a story. The story isn't even really a story. It doesn't really make sense to be critical with the source material, because the point is that it's not trying to do anything other than be a fun story for a kid. Specifically one kid. It's a handmade tale just to bring happiness to a Victorian-era little girl. The reason the book became so popular with so many children was because there really wasn't that many books made specifically for kids. The only other kids book I can think of is The Wizard of Oz, but that came out nearly 40 years after Alice in Wonderland. The weird thing is that I love Alice in Wonderland because it's not a good story. I love it because of the themes, and I love it because it broke the rules of writing, and it just did what it wanted to. And so making a movie off of it just isn't a good idea if you're trying to make an actual story from it. It's the iconography that works, not the narrative. And you'll notice that it's really only the iconography that persists when anyone refers to anything surrounding Alice in Wonderland. Tea, curious cats, cards, hatters, etc. It's because the story is fun, but it's not good, critically speaking. So if you really want to use Alice in Wonderland as the basis for your stories, then focus on the iconography, understand why the iconography is important, read the source material. It's literally a children's book, it's not hard, and build off of it. Thank you for watching my sort of very elongated rant. If you want to get the Cheshire Spade shirt that I came up with, then there's a link for it in the description below. Or if you just want to support the channel, there is my Patreon in the description as well. And don't worry, I don't usually look like this. If this is the first video you're watching, I don't usually look like this. I did this specifically for this video. Please don't judge me based off my looks just for this video. Stay beautiful and keep playing.
Thank you.